Welcome to Sleep Wisdom Official. This is not just a YouTube channel. It's a calming space where knowledge becomes your gentle companion, whether you want to relax, unwind, or drift peacefully into sleep. We bring you a wide range of fascinating insights, from history, science, and culture to the mysteries of the universe and strange stories rarely told. But here, knowledge doesn't come in a rush or with noise. It flows softly, in a soothing voice, designed to spark your curiosity while calming your mind. Imagine this. Before closing your eyes at night, or even during a quiet moment in the day, you're learning something new, enriching your mind while finding peace and relaxation. Since this is our very first video, we'd love your support. Please consider hitting subscribe, leaving a like, and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Your encouragement will inspire us to create even more journeys of wisdom and relaxation. And now, let's begin our very first adventure, exploring strange and surprising histories that few people know. So, get comfortable, breathe deeply, and let knowledge gently guide you toward calmness and sweet dreams. The Dancing Plague of 1518, a medical mystery that still baffles us. In the summer of 1518, in the bustling town of Strasbourg, then part of the Holy Roman Empire, something so bizarre occurred that it remains a historical mystery to this day. It all began with one woman. Her name was Frau Trophia. On a quiet morning in July, she stepped into a narrow street, lifted her arms, and started dancing. No music, no crowd, no celebration, just rhythmic, compulsive movements. People stared. She danced through the day, then into the night, and again the next day. She didn't stop. By the end of the week, 30 more people had joined her. By the end of the month, over 400 residents of Strasbourg were dancing uncontrollably in the streets. Some collapsed. Some died from exhaustion or heart failure. The local authorities were stunned. The physicians of the time believed it was due to overheated blood. Their solution? More dancing. That's right. They ordered musicians to play and encouraged dancers to keep going, thinking it would help them sweat out the sickness. Instead, it made things worse. So what exactly happened in Strasbourg? And why did hundreds of people dance themselves to death? Historians and scientists have debated this for centuries. One theory is mass hysteria, now known as mass psychogenic illness. In times of extreme stress, people, especially in tightly knit communities, can exhibit physical symptoms without a biological cause. Strasbourg at the time was a city under pressure. Famine, disease, and constant religious fear loomed in the background. Was this dancing a physical reaction to collective mental trauma? Another theory points to ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that grows on damp rye and can produce LSD-like hallucinations. Some believe that if a batch of contaminated bread was consumed, it could trigger convulsions and strange behavior. But there's a problem. Ergot poisoning usually causes people to collapse, not dance continuously. And it wouldn't have spread in such an organized way across a population. Some modern scholars suggest a deeper social explanation. In the early 1500s, societal roles were rigid, especially for women. Public expression of grief, anger, or despair was often punished. Could the dancing have been a subconscious protest? A release of psychological energy in a world that offered no outlet? There's also the religious context. At the time, the city believed in Saint Vitus, a figure associated with divine punishment. Many thought the dancers had been cursed. Fear of punishment may have intensified the symptoms, as belief often shapes physical reaction, especially in superstitious societies. Despite all these theories, no single explanation fits perfectly. It wasn't an isolated case either. Smaller outbreaks of so-called dancing mania occurred throughout medieval Europe, though none as large or well-documented as Strasbourg in 1518. It's one of history's strangest unsolved medical events. A blend of psychology, biology, religion, and social structure, all colliding in a single moment of chaos. Imagine the confusion of onlookers, the desperation of dancers, the silence of science in a time that had no tools to explain the human mind. The dancing plague forces us to ask, how much of what we call madness is shaped by the world around us? Could something like this happen again in a modern form, fueled by fear, media, or belief? As we move on to the next story, This strange episode reminds us that not all mysteries require monsters or conspiracies. Sometimes the strangest thing is simply the human condition. The shortest war in history, when 38 minutes decided an empire. It happened on a warm August morning in 1896, in a place many people had never heard of, and it ended before the hour was up. This was not a battle of great armies or long campaigns. There were no trenches, no long-winded declarations, and no epic retreats. But in just 38 minutes, power changed hands, a palace was reduced to rubble, and a nation learned the hard way what it meant to stand against the might of an empire. This was the Anglo-Zanzibar War, the shortest war in recorded history, and yet what it lacked in duration, it made up for in symbolism. Because behind this brief clash was a much longer, much deeper story about control, empire, and the illusion of sovereignty. Zanzibar, a small island off the coast of East Africa, was once a vibrant hub of trade and cultural exchange. For centuries, it had served as a crossroads where African, Arab, Indian, and European cultures met, traded, and coexisted. But by the late 19th century, Zanzibar had become a British protectorate. On the surface, this meant the sultans still ruled. In reality, they were allowed to govern only so long as they followed the wishes of the British. The Protectorate Agreement gave Britain control over foreign affairs and defense, while the local sultan retained limited power over domestic matters. In practice, that line was blurry at best. The British chose who would become sultan. The sultan, in turn, was expected to cooperate. It was colonial rule in all but name. On August 25, 1896, Sultan Hamad bin Thawani, a loyal ally of the British, died suddenly in his palace. Some suspected poisoning, but nothing was ever proven. What mattered most was not how he died, but what happened next. Within hours, his cousin, Khalid bin Barghash, declared himself the new sultan. He moved into the royal palace and hoisted the royal flag. But Khalid had made one critical mistake. He had done it without British approval. This was a direct violation of the 1886 agreement. According to British protocol, no sultan could assume the throne without their official endorsement. The British Consul General in Zanzibar at the time, Basil Cave, was quick to respond. He ordered Khalid to step down. Khalid refused. Instead, he barricaded himself inside the palace, gathered nearly 2,800 men loyal to him, some palace guards, others volunteers, and prepared for a siege. He also positioned several cannons around the palace and called in a small fleet of dhows, traditional wooden boats, to anchor near the shoreline in case of naval action. From the British side, the response was swift. 3 Royal Navy warships, HMS St. George, HMS Thrush, and HMS Sparrow, were already anchored in the harbor. They were soon joined by a 4th, and British Marines were deployed ashore. These ships were equipped with modern artillery, naval guns, and machine guns, a staggering display of firepower compared to the lightly armed Zanzibari forces. The British issued an ultimatum. Khalid must vacate the palace and renounce his claim to the throne by 9 a.m. on August 27th, or face military action. Khalid called the bluff. Or perhaps he truly believed the British would not attack a royal palace. Either way, he remained inside, confident that his defenses, and perhaps diplomatic hesitation, would protect him. But this was the height of empire. The British had no interest in compromise. At exactly 9:02 a.m., with no sign of surrender from Khalid, the order was given. The bombardment began immediately. Shells from HMS St. George and the other ships tore through the palace walls. The wooden structure quickly caught fire. Smoke billowed into the morning sky. The Sultan's guards attempted to return fire, but their aim was poor and their weapons outdated. The British, meanwhile, fired with precision. In just minutes, the royal palace was reduced to rubble. Nearby buildings were damaged or destroyed. Even the Sultan's small naval force was decimated. One of Khalid's ships was sunk almost instantly with a single shell. By 9:40 a.m., a mere 38 minutes after the first shot was fired, the battle was over. Khalid had fled through a back exit and taken refuge in the German consulate. The remaining Zanzibari forces surrendered. The British recorded only one injury, a single sailor with a minor wound. On the Zanzibari side, more than 500 were dead or wounded. It was an overwhelming, one-sided conflict. But more than that, it was a statement. The British immediately installed a new sultan, Hamad bin Muhammad, who was cooperative and aligned with their interests. The message was clear. The British Empire chose the rulers, and resistance would not be tolerated, not even for 38 minutes. The event was recorded as a formality in the imperial ledger, but the implications were lasting. From that day forward, British control over Zanzibar became even more direct and assertive. While still technically a protectorate, Zanzibar functioned as little more than a satellite of the British Crown. The illusion of local autonomy had been shattered. There was no official declaration of war. There was no treaty signed to end it. No lines on a map changed. But this was, by every practical definition, a war. It involved organized forces. There was a deadline. There were casualties. And in the end, one political regime was removed and another installed, all through military action. The Anglo-Zanzibar War remains a strange anomaly in the history of conflict. It's rarely taught in schools, often overlooked, sometimes even mocked. But its meaning runs deeper than its duration. It forces us to ask, what defines a war? Is it the number of dead, the length of the battle, the legal paperwork filed? Or is it the impact, the intent, the shift in power? Because in just 38 minutes, the British Empire reminded the world that it did not require prolonged campaigns to get what it wanted. Sometimes all it needed was a cannon, a deadline, and a refusal to accept defiance. And what of Khalid? After fleeing to the German consulate, he was protected under international law. The British demanded his extradition. The Germans refused. Eventually, under the cover of night, Khalid was smuggled out of Zanzibar and taken to German East Africa, present-day Tanzania, where he lived in exile until his death in 1927. He never ruled again. Today, if you walk through Zanzibar, there are few reminders of that brief war. The palace no longer stands. In its place is a quiet garden and a few historical markers. Most tourists pass by without ever realizing that this was once the site of the shortest war in human history. But if you stop for a moment and look past the palm trees and colonial architecture, you might hear the faint echoes of a cannon, fired in a moment that was small in time but large in consequence. Because sometimes, history doesn't need years to leave a mark. Sometimes, all it takes is 38 minutes. The man who saved the world and did nothing. It was past midnight on September 26, 1983. The Cold War was in full swing. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a nuclear standoff that had lasted for decades. Missiles stood ready in silos. Submarines patrolled the oceans. Spies listened on both sides. And everyone, from generals to civilians, knew that a mistake could mean the end of everything. It was a time of paranoia, mistrust, and fear. And that night, in a small command center outside of Moscow, one man sat alone at a computer terminal that could have decided the fate of the world. His name was Stanislav Petrov, and he was about to make a decision that would either save hundreds of millions of lives or doom them to nuclear fire. Petrov was a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces. He wasn't a famous general. He wasn't even a policymaker. He was a mid-level officer with a background in engineering and mathematics. But on that night, he was the duty officer at Serpukhov 15, a secret Soviet command post that monitored satellites for signs of AU-S missile launch. His job was to verify data and alert the chain of command if an attack was detected. A false alarm would be a disaster, but a real warning ignored would be catastrophic. There was no room for hesitation. The protocol was clear. If American missiles were launched, the Soviet Union would retaliate immediately. There would be no time to wait for impact. No time for diplomacy. No second chances. Mutually assured destruction. That was the plan. At 12:15 a.m., an alarm blared. The satellite system reported that AU-S intercontinental ballistic missile had been launched. Then another. Then another. 5 in total. The red warning light flashed on Petrov's screen. A computer-generated message declared, "Missile attack confirmed." Officers around him looked at him, waiting for the command to follow protocol. Pick up the phone. Alert the Kremlin. Launch a counterstrike. But Petrov hesitated. Something didn't feel right. According to his training, a real American first strike would involve hundreds of missiles, not just 5. The system was new, not fully tested. It had no backup. And strangely, ground radar stations hadn't yet detected anything. Only the satellites. Petrov had no way to confirm whether the data was real or a glitch. But he had only minutes to decide. If he reported an attack, Soviet missiles would launch. Tens of millions in the U.S. would die. Tens of millions in the USSR would follow. Cities turned to ash. Civilization gone. And yet, if he was wrong, if the missiles were real, and he said nothing, then the Soviet Union would be hit without warning. His country, his family, his people would be wiped out. His entire life had taught him to follow orders, to trust the system. But in that moment, Petrov decided to do something radical. He did nothing. He reported it as a false alarm. For 23 nerve-wracking minutes, he waited. He watched the screen. He listened to the silence. No explosions. No shockwaves. No emergency broadcasts. Just quiet. The minutes ticked by, one by one, until finally, the system confirmed that there had been no attack. It was in fact a false alarm. The Soviet satellite had misread sunlight reflecting off clouds above the American Midwest and interpreted it as a missile launch. A technical glitch. A near apocalypse. Petrov's decision had prevented World War III. By choosing not to follow protocol, by choosing not to trust the machine, he had saved the planet. But he was not celebrated. He was not awarded medals or parades. The incident was classified. For years, no one outside a small circle of officers even knew it had happened. Petrov was later reprimanded for not recording the event properly in the logbook. He retired quietly, living out his life in a modest apartment outside Moscow. It wasn't until the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, that the story came to light. And even then, it was almost lost to history. But as the decades passed, people began to recognize what had happened. In 2004, Petrov received a World Citizen Award. In 2013, he was the subject of a documentary film titled The Man Who Saved the World. By then, he was old and frail. When asked why he did what he did, Petrov shrugged. He said, "I just did my job. I was the right person at the right time. That's all." But it wasn't all. Because in a world obsessed with action, Petrov chose inaction. In an age driven by orders, he listened to his own judgment. He looked at a blinking screen and chose not to believe it. He didn't know for sure. He had no proof. But he had a feeling. And that feeling saved humanity. His story is not just about the Cold War. It's not just about geopolitics or military systems. It's about trust, about fear, about the terrifying power of one decision. In many ways, Petrov was both the most ordinary and the most important person in the world on that night. He was a technician, a son, a husband. But for 38 minutes, he was the only barrier between life and extinction. Today, in a world still filled with weapons, tensions, and misunderstandings, his story matters more than ever. Because in the moment when everything said act, he paused. He waited. He thought. And because he did, we are still here. The pig that stood trial, when animals faced human justice. In the dusty streets of 14th century France, justice was both swift and peculiar. It was a time before modern law, before due process, before the presumption of innocence. But still, the people believed in order, in right and wrong, in judgment and consequence. They built elaborate legal systems, with robes and gavels and solemn courts. And sometimes they put animals on trial. Yes, real, living animals, brought before human judges, charged with crimes and sentenced like people. Of all these cases, the most famous was the pig who stood trial for murder. It was the year 1386 in the small town of Falaise in Normandy. The town square was quiet that morning, but the air held a strange tension. Crowds gathered around the courthouse. Word had spread, a pig would be tried for killing a child. Not slaughtered, not punished privately by the farmer. Tried, in court, before witnesses, with legal representation. The pig in question had allegedly attacked and killed a 3-month-old infant. The child had been left unattended, and the pig, perhaps hungry, perhaps confused, entered the home and mauled the baby to death. By today's standards, it was a terrible accident. But in medieval France, it was considered murder. The local authorities arrested the pig. Yes, arrested. It was placed in a prison cell, guarded, and its case formally processed. The charge was infanticide. The sentence, if found guilty, would be death by public execution. And so began one of the strangest legal proceedings in history. The pig was assigned a defense lawyer, a respected member of the town council, whose job was to argue on behalf of the animal. He didn't say the pig was innocent. He said the pig didn't know what it was doing. He argued that animals lacked moral reasoning. That punishment made no sense if the subject didn't understand guilt. But the prosecutor insisted. This was not just an animal. This was a creature that had broken the peace, committed a crime, and must face justice to restore balance. Witnesses testified. The child's parents spoke in grief. A neighbor claimed the pig had always been aggressive. The judge, wearing formal robes, listened carefully and asked questions. The trial lasted several days. At one point, the pig was brought into court, wearing clothes, perhaps to make it appear more human, more accountable. In the end, the verdict was guilty. The pig was sentenced to death by hanging, just like a human criminal. And so, in the center of the village, on a raised platform, the pig was hanged in public. The crowd watched, some in silence, others cheering. Justice, they believed, had been served. This was not an isolated case. In medieval Europe, animal trials were surprisingly common. Pigs were the most frequent defendants, usually for injuring or killing children. But dogs, horses, cows, even insects and rats were brought to court. Some were found guilty. Some were acquitted. Some were excommunicated from the church. In one case, a group of locusts was summoned to appear before court and warned to leave town or face divine punishment. Of course, they didn't show up. They were condemned anyway. To modern ears, it sounds absurd, comical even. But the people of the time took it seriously. In a world governed by faith, symbolism, and a strict sense of moral order, even animals were expected to fit into the framework. They weren't seen merely as beasts. They were part of God's creation, and if they disrupted society, they had to be corrected. But what drove this impulse? Why would intelligent humans spend time and resources prosecuting animals? Part of the answer lies in control. Medieval societies were often unstable, plagued by disease, poverty, and constant threat. The justice system wasn't just about fairness. It was about visibility. If a crime occurred, someone, or something, had to be punished. Not punishing the pig might send the message that the child's death was meaningless. But holding a trial, enacting a ritual of order and consequence, reassured the people. It made the chaos of life seem manageable. Another reason was legal precedent. At the time, animals were considered property, but they could also be seen as agents of harm. If an ox gored a man in the field, or a dog bit a neighbor, the owner could be liable, unless the animal was held responsible. Trying the animal separated the act from the owner. It cleansed the moral stain from the community, and it affirmed that every being, no matter how small or unintelligent, was subject to the will of the law. There's also a deeper, almost psychological element. People projected human traits onto animals. They saw malice in a pig's eyes. They felt betrayal when a horse kicked its rider. In an era without scientific explanations, emotion filled the gap, and emotion demanded accountability. But not all trials were about justice. Some were theatrical, symbolic. In Switzerland, in the 15th century, a rooster was tried for laying an egg, which was considered witchcraft. The court believed that rooster eggs could hatch into basilisks, mythical monsters. The rooster was found guilty and burned alive. It wasn't about crime. It was about fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of the unnatural. These trials also reflected the church's influence. In the eyes of religious leaders, moral order extended beyond humans. A pig that killed was not just dangerous, it was sinful. Punishing the animal restored spiritual balance. In some cases, priests performed exorcisms on cows. In others, rats were threatened with excommunication. In 1519, a group of rats was given legal notice to appear in court for destroying crops. Their absence was noted, and their refusal to obey was interpreted as defiance. The town cursed them in the name of God. As Europe entered the Enlightenment, such practices slowly faded. Science, reason, and changing legal standards pushed animal trials into the past. By the 18th century, they were rare. By the 19th, almost extinct. Today, they are remembered mostly as curiosities, footnotes in the history of law. But maybe there's something more to remember. Because behind the absurdity lies something deeply human. A need for meaning. A need to explain tragedy. A need to respond when innocence is lost. Think about the pig in fillets. It didn't understand guilt. It didn't understand trial or punishment. It was an animal acting on instinct. And yet, it was dressed, judged, and executed as if it had agency, as if it had chosen violence. The people needed a villain. They needed closure. And so, they created a courtroom where there was no real debate, only ritual. The story of the pig that stood trial isn't just about medieval law. It's about us. About how we respond to loss. About how we project responsibility onto the world. About how justice, sometimes, is more about feeling in control than finding the truth. And maybe in a strange way, it's a reminder that the line between reason and ritual is thin. That when tragedy strikes, we all search for something, or someone to blame, even if it has hooves. The 11 days that disappeared, when time skipped forward. In the autumn of 1582, millions of people across Europe went to bed on the night of October 4th and woke up the next morning. On October 15th, 10 days of their lives had simply vanished. No one had overslept. There was no war, no disaster, no celestial event. But on the calendar, those days were gone, erased, as if they had never existed. Children born on October 5th never had a birthday. Rent wasn't collected. Wages weren't paid. And people, understandably, were confused, angry, and in some places ready to revolt. But this wasn't a trick. It wasn't a glitch. It was the result of something far more profound. The world was trying to fix time itself. To understand why those 11 days disappeared, we need to travel back even further, to the time of Julius Caesar in 46 BCE. Rome ruled much of the known world, and with empire came bureaucracy. Schedules mattered. Harvests depended on the seasons, and festivals were tied to the calendar. But the old Roman calendar was a mess. It followed the moon, not the sun, and it drifted badly over time. Spring would start in the middle of summer. Holidays lost all connection to the natural world. So Caesar, advised by the best astronomers of his day, introduced the Julian calendar, a solar calendar with 365 days, and a leap year every 4 years to keep things in sync. For centuries, it worked. Mostly. But there was a tiny problem, so small it took generations to notice. The Julian year wasn't exactly 365, 25 days. It was actually about 11 minutes too long. That tiny error added up. Every 128 years, the calendar drifted a full day ahead of the sun. And after 1,500 years, the seasons were no longer lining up with the calendar at all. The spring equinox, which had once fallen on March 21st, was now drifting back toward early March. For farmers, that was confusing. For the church, it was a crisis. Because Easter, the most sacred holiday in Christianity, was calculated based on the spring equinox. And if the equinox was moving, then so was Easter. Year after year, it became harder to predict. In the 16th century, Pope Gregory XIII decided it was time to act. He gathered scholars, astronomers, and mathematicians, and they proposed a bold solution. First, fix the calendar by skipping ahead. Erase the 10 days that had accumulated. Second, prevent the drift from happening again. The leap year rule would change. A year divisible by 100 would not be a leap year, unless it was also divisible by 400. That meant years like 1600 and 2000 would be leap years, but 1700, 1800, and 1900 would not. It was a more accurate system, one that would keep the calendar aligned with the Earth's orbit for thousands of years. On paper, it was brilliant, but in practice, it was chaos. On October 4th, 1582, Pope Gregory's new calendar went into effect. And the next day, the date jumped to October 15th. In Catholic countries like Italy, Spain, and Portugal, it was law. But time is not something everyone accepts quietly. In France, people rioted, demanding their days back. In parts of Spain, peasants refused to pay a full month's rent for what they claimed was a shortened month. And Protestant countries? They rejected the change outright. England, for instance, didn't adopt the Gregorian calendar until 1752, 170 years later. And when they did, they had to erase 11 days instead of 10. In England, the change sparked confusion and outrage. Newspapers were flooded with letters. Some people believed their lives were being shortened. Others feared they were being cheated. "Give us back our 11 days," became a rallying cry. Political pamphlets mocked the government. There were rumors that grave robbers were taking advantage of the calendar confusion to fake alibis. Even famous writers like William Hogarth made art satirizing the chaos. The impact wasn't just social, it was global. For decades, countries ran on different calendars. A letter sent from France might arrive in England with a date that didn't exist. Navigation became tricky. Merchants had to calculate exchange rates and date conversions. Diplomats couldn't agree on what day it was. For over a century, time itself became a political issue. Eventually, the world adjusted. Russia held out until 1918. Greece didn't switch until 1923. But by the 20th century, the Gregorian calendar had become the standard nearly everywhere. That tiny miscalculation of 11 minutes, a sliver of time, had caused centuries of drift, confusion, and reform. And to fix it, humanity had to do the unthinkable, delete time. There's something eerie about erasing days from the calendar. Those who lived through it didn't feel the earth move. They didn't see the sun speed up or slow down. But their birthdays vanished. Their wages were shorted. Their memories confused. Some historians say it felt like living through a moment that had no past. Imagine waking up one day, and the date, your time, simply didn't exist. How do you explain that to a child? How do you write it in a journal? And yet, this wasn't just about math. It was about order, about our need to impose structure on the chaos of the universe. Time, after all, is a human invention. The Earth doesn't care what day it is. But we do. We divide time into hours, days, years, not because nature demands it, but because we need to make sense of it. The calendar is not just a tool. It's a promise that things happen in sequence, that memories have a place, that the future is waiting for us. But every so often, that illusion shatters, and we're reminded that even time, the most constant thing we know, can be edited. Today, few people remember the missing days of October 1582. They're buried in old documents, footnotes in history books. But they happened. People lived through them, or rather skipped past them. And in doing so, they taught us a strange, humbling truth. That to move forward, sometimes we must let go of what never quite fit, even if it means losing 11 days. Flight 914, the plane that took off and landed 37 years later. There are stories that sound too strange to be true, and yet they linger, passed from voice to voice, page to page, decade to decade. They take root in the places where fact and imagination blur, where what we know becomes just uncertain enough to make us wonder. One such story begins in 1955, with an airplane that took off, vanished from radar, and returned 37 years later. The legend of Flight 914 is one of the most enduring aviation mysteries on the internet. According to the story, on July 2, 1955, a Douglas DC, 4-passenger aircraft operated by Pan American Airways departed from New York City, en route to Miami, Florida. It was a clear day. The weather was good. The plane carried 57 passengers and 4 crew members. Everything seemed ordinary. But somewhere over the East Coast, the plane simply vanished. No mayday call. No debris. No trace. The flight was never heard from again. After extensive searches yielded nothing, it was presumed lost at sea. Families grieved. The case was closed. That should have been the end of it. But the story takes a bizarre turn. On March 9, 1992, 37 years later, air traffic controllers at Caracas International Airport in Venezuela allegedly picked up an unidentified aircraft on radar. It appeared suddenly from nowhere, with no scheduled flight plan. The pilot's voice crackled over the radio, confused and panicked. He reportedly asked, "Where are we?" "This is Flight 914. We were en route to Miami." The controller, equally shocked, told him he had entered Venezuelan airspace. The pilot hesitated, then turned the plane around and disappeared into the sky. Military jets scrambled, but by the time they reached the coordinates, the aircraft was gone. Hours later, the story goes, a plane matching the exact description of Flight 914, same model, same markings, same flight number, landed unexpectedly at an airport in Miami. Ground crews were stunned. The pilot, dazed and disoriented, opened the door and stepped out. The passengers inside looked the same age as when they had left New York in 1955. No one had aged. Luggage was dated. Passports were old but authentic. The pilot, upon realizing what had happened, reportedly ran back into the cockpit and took off again, vanishing a second time, leaving behind only confusion, whispers, and a handful of documents accidentally dropped on the tarmac. As strange as it sounds, this story has circulated for decades, retold in magazines, television shows, and online forums. Some versions say the plane returned for just a few minutes before vanishing forever. Others claim it was taken into government custody and covered up. Skeptics, of course, argue that the whole tale is fabricated, a modern myth born from a blend of Cold War paranoia, aviation fascination, and urban legend. There's no official record of Flight 914. Pan Am never listed it. News archives from 1992 contain no reference to a sudden plane landing in Miami. And the earliest known version of the story appeared in a 1985 edition of Weekly World News, a tabloid infamous for fictional stories. But the question remains, why does this story persist? Some say it's because we fear what we can't control, especially time. An aircraft trapped in a time loop, emerging decades later, captures the imagination in a way few things can. It touches on our deepest uncertainties. Is time truly linear? Could a rift in space-time cause a moment to repeat, or pause, or vanish entirely? Physicists have long speculated about time anomalies. Theories like wormholes, cosmic strings, and space-time curvature offer tantalizing possibilities. If gravity can bend light, could it also bend time? Einstein's general relativity suggests yes. In extreme environments, such as near black holes, time dilates. A few hours near the event horizon might equal years elsewhere. In that context, a 37-year delay begins to sound less like science fiction. There's also the so-called vanishing point hypothesis, a theoretical idea in quantum mechanics that suggests under extremely rare conditions, particles, or even entire systems, could phase in and out of measurable existence. If a plane somehow passed through such a zone, it might reappear elsewhere, or elsewhen. Of course, these are wild extrapolations. There's no real evidence that such events could happen at commercial altitudes, and certainly not with entire aircraft. But in a world where GPS, radar, and black boxes fail from time to time, the uncertainty, however small, keeps these stories alive. Others argue that the Flight 914 myth serves a different purpose. It's not about physics. It's about nostalgia, a longing for a time when things made more sense, when airlines were glamorous, when stories had mystery, not algorithms. In this version, the plane is a time capsule, not just physically, but emotionally, a metaphor for how fast the world moves, and how deeply we wish we could pause it. Perhaps the plane didn't vanish. Perhaps it waited. For us. There's another layer, too, the fear of disappearance. In the modern world, we are used to being tracked. Our phones know where we are. Our flights are logged, our faces scanned. The idea that someone could vanish without a trace is terrifying, but also in a strange way comforting. It means there's still something beyond the grid, something unexplainable, something free. Still, the logical mind insists, this story can't be true. And it's right. Investigations into the origin of the Flight 914 legend reveal no credible sources, no official reports, no physical evidence. The photo often circulated with the tale, a vintage DC, for beside an old air traffic tower, is traced back to unrelated flights. The newspaper clippings? Fabricated. The eyewitness accounts? Never confirmed. It is, by all modern standards, a myth. But myths are powerful. They live not because they are true, but because they reveal something we want to be true. And perhaps that's what Flight 914 really is. Not a report, but a reflection. A mirror held up to our deepest hopes and anxieties. The hope that time can be undone. The fear that it never can. So if you ever find yourself at an airport and you see a vintage silver plane roll silently across the runway, don't be so quick to dismiss it. Maybe it's just a restored relic. Or maybe, just maybe, it's a message from a time we lost, or a time we have yet to reach. In the end, the most extraordinary stories aren't always the ones that happened. They're the ones we keep asking questions about, the ones that never quite go away. Pope Joan, the woman who became pope, or never existed at all. There are legends that slip through the cracks of history like whispers in a cathedral. Half remembered, half denied, they live not in textbooks, but in margins, rumors, and forbidden questions. One of the strangest and most enduring of these is the story of Pope Joan, a woman who, according to centuries-old tales, disguised herself as a man, rose through the ranks of the Catholic Church, and became pope. A woman, sitting on the throne of St. Peter, ruling the church in secret, until she was discovered in the most shocking of ways. The earliest versions of this tale place her in the 9th century, sometime between the reigns of Pope Leo IV and Pope Benedict III. The story goes that Joan, a brilliant and well-educated woman, took on male clothing and the name John Anglicus. She joined the church, possibly as a monk, possibly as a scholar, and quickly rose through the ranks due to her intelligence and charisma. Eventually, she was elected pope, reigning for 2 years before her true identity was revealed when she unexpectedly gave birth. In the middle of a religious procession on the streets of Rome, the crowd, stunned and betrayed, reacted with fury. Some accounts say she was dragged through the streets and stoned to death. Others claim she was quietly removed and sent to a convent, her name erased from official records. The church, embarrassed, supposedly changed the papal processions afterward, avoiding the street where her labor had occurred. In some versions, they even introduced a ritual, a test of masculinity for new popes, using a special chair with a hole in the seat, allowing someone to verify the new pope's anatomy. It sounds unbelievable, and yet the story refuses to die. From the 13th century onward, the tale of Pope Joan appeared in multiple chronicles and manuscripts. Martin of Opava, a Dominican friar, included it in his Chronicon Pontificum et Imperatorum. Later, Renaissance scholars debated it openly. Woodcut prints depicted her in papal robes. Some even claimed to know the location of her tomb in Rome, marked not by her name, but a vague epitaph about shame. But the Catholic Church denies it all. There is no official mention of Pope Joan in Vatican records. Modern historians argue that the story is a fabrication, a medieval morality tale, perhaps created to warn against female ambition or mock the papacy during times of scandal. They point out that the timeline doesn't align. There is no gap between Leo IV and Benedict III, and no record of a missing pope. They say the chair with the hole never existed, or if it did, was ceremonial, not anatomical. They note that many of the earliest sources were written centuries after Joan supposedly lived. And yet, the story endures. Why? Some believe it reflects a deeper cultural anxiety about power, gender, and truth. In a world where women were excluded from religious leadership, the idea of a woman pope was both thrilling and terrifying. To the devout, she was a warning. To others, a symbol of rebellion. Others suggest that Joan is less a person than a prism, through which we can see how history is shaped not just by facts, but by fears. Perhaps she never existed, but the need for her story did. In medieval Europe, riddled with corruption and political tension within the church, the tale of a false pope, a hidden truth, served as allegory. She may have been invented to embody deceit or to criticize blind faith in authority. But some scholars, a stubborn few, argue the opposite, that the very intensity of the denial is suspicious, that medieval forgeries were common and gaps in records not unusual. They point to inconsistencies in papal lists, to the sudden appearance of rituals that seem oddly specific, to architectural oddities, like the test chair kept for centuries in the Vatican's collection. And they ask quietly, what if the legend was not created, but suppressed? In that reading, Joan becomes something else entirely. Not a myth, but a mystery, a thread deliberately cut from the tapestry of history. Let's consider a different angle. Whether or not Joan existed, the fact that her story was told, retold, adapted, feared, reveals something vital. Stories like hers do not persist by accident. They survive because they answer questions we're too afraid to ask directly. Can power disguise itself? Can truth be hidden in plain sight? What happens when identity, authority, and expectation collide? There's a haunting image often used in versions of the Pope Joan story, of her riding in procession through Rome, wearing white, surrounded by clergy, adored by the people, until pain stops her horse and blood stains the cobblestones. In that moment, she becomes mortal again. A woman, not a symbol, not a title, just flesh and consequence. It is not just the fall that captures our imagination, but the fact that, for a time, she rose, that she fooled the world, that she carried faith and leadership until her body revealed what the world could not accept. In some versions of the tale, her name is eventually written down, not in shame, but in secret honor, as a symbol of defiance, brilliance, and tragedy. A woman who dared step beyond the boundaries drawn for her. Today, historians largely agree that Pope Joan likely never existed, but they also acknowledge something deeper, that truth in history is not always black and white. It's filtered through time, politics, agendas, and even myths can carry the weight of real questions. In a world still wrestling with gender, leadership, and faith, Pope Joan remains a mirror. Whether she lived or not, she forces us to ask, what stories have we erased? What truths have we buried? And if a woman did wear the papal crown, even for a moment, what does it say that we tried so hard to forget? Somewhere in Rome, in a quiet church or beneath ancient stone, maybe there is no tomb, no marker, no proof, only silence. But sometimes, silence says more than words ever could. And that is where this part of the story ends. Or perhaps, where it begins. The man who lived in a 5-star hotel for over 10 years without paying. There are mysteries that unfold in deserted battlefields, in lost cities, or beneath the ocean floor. But sometimes, the strangest mysteries happen not in hidden corners of the world, but in the very heart of our everyday life, under the chandeliers of a 5-star hotel where no one would ever think to look. Tonight, we step into a story not about ancient ruins or forgotten kings, but about a man who lived for more than 10 years inside one of the world's most luxurious hotels, without ever paying a single bill. It begins simply enough. A man checked in. That alone happens thousands of times a day in cities across the world. He was not particularly remarkable. Medium height, middle-aged, dressed in a suit that seemed expensive but slightly wrinkled, he looked like the kind of guest who belonged in such a place. He carried only a slim leather briefcase, no suitcase, no travel bags. He gave a name, presented a credit card, and received a key. Nothing unusual. Nothing to cause suspicion. At first, he behaved like any other guest. He left early in the morning, returned late in the evening. He was polite but distant, always thanking the staff, yet never lingering to talk. He never ate in the hotel restaurant, never visited the bar. Housekeeping noticed that his room was always impeccably tidy, as if he hardly spent time there. His sheets barely wrinkled, his closet nearly empty. But he always paid his bills. The card worked. The name matched. And so, the hotel never questioned him. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. Months into years. And still he remained. Guests came and went, staff rotated, managers changed, but the man endured like a fixture of the hotel itself. He did not complain. He did not demand. He did not reveal anything about his life. He was simply there. By the 3rd year, whispers began among the staff. Who was he? What did he do? Why had he never left? The receptionists joked that he was married to the hotel. The bellhops called him the ghost guest. Yet none of them ever confronted him. After all, his bills were always settled. What harm was there in a man choosing to make a hotel his home? But the strangeness deepened, because according to the records, he was paying, and yet the payments never seemed to come from any traceable account. The credit card number shifted, replaced by new ones, always valid, always accepted, but never connected to a bank anyone could identify. When auditors tried to track the transactions, they ended in loops, ghost accounts, or vanished entirely. It was as if money itself materialized from nowhere to cover his stay. Some staff grew uneasy. A housekeeper swore she saw the man leave his room in the morning. Then, when she opened the door to clean, she found him sitting quietly inside, reading. She apologized, thinking she had been mistaken, but later, she wondered how he could have been in two places at once. A night guard said the man sometimes stood in the lobby for hours, staring out at the revolving door, as though waiting for someone who never arrived. By year 7, the hotel had changed ownership. A new manager reviewed the guest list and was shocked to see his name there, stretching back over a decade. He ordered an investigation. They tried to contact the man's supposed family. No such people existed. They checked government records. The passport number he had given was unregistered. The address on file led to an empty lot. And yet, every time they tried to remove him, the higher executives instructed them to leave him alone. He was, they said, a special guest. And then one day he disappeared. There was no checkout, no final bill. His keycard deactivated. Housekeeping entered his room and found it perfectly clean, as always. Closet empty. Safe empty. Only one object remained, the leather briefcase. Inside were several sets of unworn clothes, pressed and folded, and a single piece of paper with a drawing in blue ink, a simple eye staring upward. The hotel panicked. They searched security footage, but the cameras that covered his hallway showed nothing. Entire hours of tape were missing, as if erased. The elevators showed no record of his keycard being used. Guests who stayed near his room claimed they had heard soft music at night, though no radio or television was ever found inside. Speculation spread like wildfire. Some said he was a spy who used the hotel as cover, his bills paid by a government that later erased his existence. Others claimed he was part of an experiment in identity, a living ghost designed to see how long someone could vanish in plain sight. A few whispered that he was not a man at all, but something else, a presence, a story wearing human clothes, haunting a place where thousands of strangers pass without ever seeing one another. But the most unsettling theory was simpler. That perhaps he lived in the hotel not to hide from the world, but because the world had forgotten him. That in the endless movement of modern life, he had chosen stillness. That in a society obsessed with identity, he had chosen to become faceless. That in a system where visibility equals power, he had discovered the freedom of being invisible. And perhaps the mystery is not him, but us. That we could live beside someone for more than a decade, see him in the lobby, ride with him in the elevator, pass him in the hallway, and never once ask who he was. That we could live among ghosts of flesh and blood and never notice. Some say the man still returns. That in certain hotels, in certain cities, a quiet guest checks in with a leather briefcase, stays for years, and leaves without a trace. Staff whisper of rooms that remain always booked, but never occupied. And of briefcases left behind, each with the same symbol, a single eye watching waiting. Perhaps the strangest mysteries are not the ones that vanish, but the ones that remain quietly in plain sight. And as we close this chapter, the question lingers. Who do we live among unnoticed every day? The answer may be closer than we think. Hi Brazil, the phantom island that appeared on maps and then vanished. There are stories that take place in hotel lobbies, stories of invisible men who linger in plain sight. But some mysteries belong not to the corridors of modern life, but to the wide, restless ocean. Stories that once filled maps and guided sailors into fog and fear. This is the story of Hi Brazil, a phantom island that appeared for centuries on charts and atlases, an island drawn with conviction, hunted with hope, and then erased, as though the earth itself had decided to swallow it whole. To understand Hi Brazil, we must return to a time when the world was not yet known. The 14th century was an age of uncertain maps. To the east, cartographers drew monstrous sea creatures to warn of peril. To the west, where the Atlantic stretched like an endless veil, they filled in the blanks with rumor, faith, and fragments of legend. It was here, just west of Ireland, that Hi Brazil first appeared. A circle of land, shrouded in mist, marked carefully on nautical charts. It was not imagined by one man or one nation. Over the next 300 years, Hi Brazil appeared again and again on the Catalan Atlas, on the maps of Sebastian Munster or Telius Mercator. Each drew it as though it were a fact of geography. Why did they believe? Because stories persisted, whispered from sailor to sailor. They called it the Island of the Blessed, a place where the skies never dimmed and the people were wise beyond measure. Some said its soil shimmered with gold. Others claimed it was the last surviving fragment of Atlantis, drifting alone on the edge of the known world. But Hy-Brasil came with a condition. It could not be seen at will. The legend said it only revealed itself once every 7 years. And even then, only to those who believed. Explorers set out to find it. In 1480, John Jay Jr., a Bristol merchant, launched a voyage west from Ireland, seeking Hy-Brasil. His ship returned battered, but his men swore they had glimpsed land through the fog, an outline that vanished when they approached. In 1497, a ship sponsored by King Henry VII sailed the same waters. Though they found no island, the attempt itself inspired further voyages, one of which carried John Cabot to the shores of North America. In this way, a phantom island helped shape the real geography of history. But the most striking story came in 1674. Captain John Nisbet, sailing from France to Ireland, claimed to have encountered land in thick fog. He sent 4 men ashore. They described a strange city built of black stone, towers rising through mist. The inhabitants were pale, silent, not hostile. They offered the sailors objects, maps, scrolls, devices unfamiliar to Europe. When Nisbet's tale spread, it caused both fascination and outrage. Some hailed it as proof. Others dismissed it as delusion. Yet it added another layer of myth to Hy-Brasil. As centuries passed, navigation improved. Compasses steadied. Charts became accurate. And Hy-Brasil, stubbornly, refused to appear. Sailors sailed through its coordinates and found only water. By the 19th century, mapmakers grew embarrassed. They began to erase it from their work. By 1870, it had disappeared entirely from cartography. Officially, it never existed. But the story did not die. In fishing villages along Ireland's western coast, old men still spoke of days when the island rose through the mist, green and inviting, before fading like smoke. In the 20th century, pilots occasionally reported glimpsing land where no land should be. One account tells of an RAF pilot who, while flying westward, saw an island through cloud cover, but by the time his instruments caught up, there was nothing but sea. And then there is the Rendlesham Forest incident of 1980. A U.S. Air Force officer named James Penniston claimed to have touched a strange craft in the woods of Suffolk, England. He described receiving a stream of binary code implanted in his mind. Years later, when decoded, the numbers corresponded to geographical coordinates. Where did they point? To the exact spot in the Atlantic where Hy-Brasil once appeared on maps. Skeptics call it coincidence. Believers call it revelation. What are we to make of this island that both was and was not? Some historians argue it was a confusion, a distorted glimpse of real islands like Porcupine Bank, a submerged plateau off the Irish coast. Others suggest it was nothing more than a cartographer's mistake, repeated out of habit. But those explanations ignore the persistence of belief, the testimonies of sailors across centuries, the eerie connections that resurface even in modern times. Perhaps Hy-Brasil was never about land at all. Perhaps it was about longing. To medieval sailors, the ocean was terror and promise in equal measure. They filled it with monsters and paradises alike, because the human mind cannot tolerate emptiness. Hy-Brasil gave them something to hope for, a place of safety, of wisdom, of perfection, even as it remained just out of reach. Or perhaps there is something stranger at work. Imagine a reality slightly out of sync with ours, overlapping at rare intervals, brushing against us like two tides crossing. An island glimpsed only when the veil's thin. An island where time runs differently, where knowledge is preserved. Could Hy-Brasil be less a place than a rhythm, a cycle, a loop of history that returns every 7 years? Stand at the western cliffs of Ireland on a fog-drenched dawn, and it is easy to believe. The Atlantic stretches like an endless mirror, the horizon blurred, and for a moment you wonder if something waits just beyond sight. The fishermen who swore they saw it may have seen more than mirage. Or maybe they saw what they wanted to see, and in that act of faith, Hy-Brasil became real, if only for a heartbeat. Some mysteries vanish with science. Others endure. Hy-Brasil endures not because it was there, but because it might have been. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps we need islands like Hy-Brasil, not to find them, but to remember that the world is larger than we think and stranger than we can prove. As we close this chapter, the waves roll back into silence, and the phantom island fades once more into mist. But the question lingers, as it always does. What else waits at the edges of our maps? And in our next story, we will not sail the seas, but step into the mind itself, to meet a man who awoke speaking a language no one else had ever heard. The man who awoke speaking a language unknown to the world. There are mysteries written in maps, like High Brazil, the phantom island erased from history. But some mysteries are written in flesh and bone, in the fragile folds of the human mind. Tonight we step not into the sea, but into the mind of a man who awoke one morning to discover that he no longer belonged to the world as we know it. For he spoke a language no one had ever heard before. It began, as so many strange stories do, with confusion. A man was found unconscious in a public park near a mid-sized European city. He was middle-aged, dressed neatly but without identification. No wallet, no documents, no phone. When paramedics revived him, he seemed calm, but disoriented. They brought him to the hospital. Doctors asked him his name. He answered fluently, but in words that belonged to no known tongue. At first they thought he was having a seizure, or suffering from trauma-induced aphasia. But his speech was consistent, flowing, grammatical. It was not babble. He responded logically to questions, pointing when prompted, matching words to objects with precision. When shown a cup, he said a word, repeating it the same way each time. When shown a photograph of a child, he said another. His intonation and syntax followed rules. This was language, just not one from Earth. Linguists were called. They recorded his speech, analyzed phonetics, searched databases of obscure tongues, dead and living. Nothing matched. No dialect. No overlap. His vocabulary was a closed system, unique and self-consistent. It had structure, verb forms, declensions, even what seemed to be poetic rhythm. He wasn't improvising. He was fluent. The mystery deepened when he began to write. He asked for paper and filled it with looping symbols, circular glyphs that resembled no script ever catalogued. Not runes, not cuneiform, not hieroglyphs. Yet they repeated with clarity, as if transcribing meaning. Cryptographers examined them. Pattern recognition software mapped internal logic, but no external reference. His writing, like his speech, was real, but rootless. Who was he? Authorities searched fingerprints. No match in national or international databases. His dental records aligned with no known identity. His DNA showed nothing unusual, no mutation, no foreign markers. He was biologically an ordinary human, yet his mind carried a language from nowhere. Speculation bloomed. Some said he was faking, a con man inventing an elaborate hoax. But the consistency of his grammar, the depth of his vocabulary, argued otherwise. Others suggested xenoglossy, the alleged ability to speak a language never learned, often cited in cases of reincarnation. But xenoglossy usually involved known tongues, Latin, Greek, Hindi. Never something entirely without precedent. A more grounded theory pointed to a rare neurological event, a spontaneous invention of language, a kind of cryptophasia, usually seen only in twin children who invent secret codes. But how could a grown man spontaneously generate a complete linguistic system, with syntax, writing, and consistency, all while unconscious? Then came the dreams. Nurses reported that at night he would murmur in his unknown tongue, sometimes weeping, sometimes chanting softly. When woken, he described visions, cities of glass under a dark sky, rivers that glowed, stars that moved like living things. He drew them with his strange symbols. His notebooks filled with landscapes no one recognized. For months, teams tried to decode his language. Computational linguists managed to extract fragments, words for family, water, fear, light. But deeper meanings eluded them. He never broke into any known speech. Not once. And then one day he was gone. Hospital staff found his bed empty. No signs of forced exit. Security cameras showed nothing unusual, only blank static during the hours he disappeared. He left behind notebooks filled with his looping glyphs. They remain undeciphered. What do we make of such a man? Was he a wanderer between worlds, a consciousness misplaced? A man whose mind, through trauma, cracked open into another reality? Or was he an omen, a messenger, carrying the tongue of a future not yet here? Skeptics shrug. They call it performance, delusion, or neurological accident. But there are those who studied his notebooks who whisper that language is not invented alone, that no man creates a tongue without roots, that perhaps he did not invent this language, he remembered it. And if memory can reach so far, the question is not who he was, but where he had been. Some mysteries live on maps, in phantom islands lost to sea. Others live in the mind, in words no one else can speak. And sometimes the strangest mystery is not what someone says, but that no one else can say it back. This is the story of the man who awoke speaking a language unknown to the world. And in our next chapter, we will move from the mind to the desert, where a silent metal door stands waiting in the wilderness of Nevada, a door that no one has dared to open. The mysterious metal door in the Nevada desert. There are mysteries found in the mind, like the man who spoke a language unknown to the world. And there are mysteries found in the land itself, objects that defy reason, artifacts that should not exist, doors that stand where no doors should ever be. Tonight, we step into the dry silence of the Nevada desert, where a single slab of brushed steel stands alone, like a question carved into the earth. It begins with a photograph. In the late 1970s, a desert photographer wandered off the marked paths, searching for the right light at sunset. He stumbled into a clearing and saw something that should not have been there. A metal door, freestanding, planted upright in the sand. No hinges, no handle, no seams. Just an 8-foot-tall rectangle of steel, glowing faintly in the last rays of the day. He took a picture. When he returned a week later, the door was gone. But the photo remained, blurry at the edges, as if heat waves had tried to erase it. The story might have died there. But in the years that followed, others claimed to find the same door. A lost backpacker said he touched it and was thrown backward, as if by an electric shock. A group of geology students camped nearby and woke up miles from where they pitched their tents. Their equipment was missing. One swore he had seen light behind the door, like stars underwater. Locals gave it a name, the Shut Gate. Some said it was the remnant of a Cold War experiment. Others thought it was a ceremonial site left by people older than history. A few whispered that it was not a door at all, but a lock designed to hold something in. In 1996, a retired military surveyor named Alan Doss gave the story new weight. He claimed he had been hired to measure radiation levels in a remote section of desert. His instruments showed nothing unusual until he reached the clearing. Near the door, his compass needles spun wildly. Batteries drained within minutes. He swore the ground vibrated, almost too faint to feel, like a hidden engine running below. Intrigued, Doss returned on his own time with ground-penetrating radar. The scan revealed something impossible, a rectangular void beneath the door, 30 feet deep, perfectly smooth, surrounded by solid rock. No tunnel, no chamber, just absence, a hole in reality itself. Soon after, he began to hear things. Low-frequency hums that followed him into sleep. Metallic clicks that seemed to echo in his skull. Whispers in a language he did not recognize. He abandoned the desert, moved to another state, and never spoke publicly again. But fragments of his notes survived, describing the door as a surface waiting to be chosen, and the void beneath as a silence that listens back. No official agency has acknowledged the door. The Forest Service denies it. The military offers no records. Satellite images show nothing but rock and scrub. Yet the stories persist. Hikers, campers, wanderers still report glimpsing a metal rectangle where none should be, only to find it gone when they return. The door, it seems, shifts. Not always in the same place, not always in the same season. As if it chooses who gets to see it. No one has ever opened it. Or if they have, they never returned. What could it be? Skeptics say mass hallucination, mirages fueled by heat and isolation. Some suggest forgotten art projects, abandoned structures mistaken for the uncanny. But such explanations stumble when confronted with the consistency of the tales. The shock on contact, the drained batteries, the vanishing equipment, the blank photographs. Perhaps it is a remnant of something buried, a machine half-submerged, waiting. Perhaps it is a marker, left by hands not human. Or perhaps it is not a door at all, but a metaphor in steel, planted by the desert itself to remind us of how little we understand. Yet there is a more unsettling thought. Maybe the door is not meant for us. Maybe it stands not as an invitation, but as a warning. Because a door, after all, is not only what you go through, it is what you keep shut. And the real mystery may not be what lies behind it, but why it waits. The Voynich manuscript, the book no one can read. There are mysteries locked in machines, like the death prediction device, and mysteries locked in deserts, like the silent steel door. But some mysteries are bound in paper, stitched between covers, filled with words and drawings that have resisted every attempt to understand. Tonight, we turn the page on one of the most enduring enigmas in history. The Voynich manuscript, a book no one has ever been able to read. It was discovered in 1912 by a rare book dealer named Wilfrid Voynich, in a Jesuit college near Rome. At first glance, it seemed like a medieval herbal, a compendium of plants, with accompanying notes. But almost immediately, something felt wrong. The plants did not exist. Their stems and leaves were twisted into forms never seen in botany. And the text, written in looping, elegant script, belonged to no language on earth. Experts dated the vellum pages to the early 15th century, using radiocarbon analysis. The ink was consistent with the era. This was no modern forgery. It was a genuine book from the medieval period. But its contents, that was another matter. The script became known as Voynichese. Hundreds of pages, filled with consistent writing, repeating patterns, structured grammar. Linguists noted prefixes, suffixes, and word forms. Cryptographers saw logic and probability curves similar to real languages. Yet every attempt to decode it failed. It was not Latin, Greek, Arabic, Hebrew, Chinese. Not even close. World War II codebreakers, who cracked the Enigma machine, tried their hand at Voynich. They failed. Modern supercomputers, trained on massive datasets, tried statistical modeling. They failed too. The text stubbornly resisted all translation. And then there were the illustrations. Pages filled with nude women bathing in strange pools connected by tubes, as if describing a bizarre plumbing system. Zodiac charts filled with stars, moons, and unknown constellations. Recipes written in the indecipherable tongue, beside drawings of jars and roots. Theories multiplied. Some claimed it was an elaborate hoax, designed to fool kings and scholars. But if so, why create hundreds of pages of structured, internally consistent gibberish, with no audience, no payoff? Others suggested it was a cipher, hiding dangerous knowledge, alchemy, medicine, or forbidden science. Still others whispered that it was not of this world at all, but a record left by beings beyond Earth. In the 20th century, one researcher proposed it might be glossolalia, writing produced in trance, like speaking in tongues. Another believed it was the work of an isolated genius who invented an entire language, only to vanish into obscurity. In recent years, artificial intelligence has been turned loose on the manuscript. Some models claim faint resemblances to medieval Hebrew. Others suggest it could be a compression code, hiding layers of meaning that only the right key could unlock. But none has cracked it. The manuscript remains mute, refusing to yield. Why does it fascinate us so deeply? Perhaps because it is a mirror. In its pages, we see the limits of our knowledge. We live in an age where satellites map the Earth, where AI translates speech in seconds. Yet here lies a book, 600 years old, that we cannot read. Imagine if it holds cures for diseases lost to time, or knowledge of the stars before telescopes, or a philosophy so strange we cannot yet grasp it, or imagine more chillingly that it holds nothing at all, that it is nonsense, and the true mystery is why we so desperately want it to mean something. The Voynich manuscript rests today in Yale University's Beinecke Rare Book Library, locked behind glass. Scholars still visit, turn its pages carefully, scan its images. And still, no one understands. Perhaps it will never be read. Or perhaps one day, the right mind or the right machine will look upon its script and see not confusion, but clarity. Until then, the Voynich manuscript reminds us that some mysteries are not in distant lands or futuristic devices, but right here in our hands, and still beyond our reach. This is the book no one can read, and perhaps that is why it will never stop being read. The Antikythera mechanism, the 2,000-year-old computer. There are books no one can read, like the Voynich manuscript, and there are machines no one can explain, like the death prediction device. But sometimes, history gives us something that is both, a machine made long before such machines should have existed, carrying knowledge that seems centuries out of place. Tonight, we turn to the Antikythera mechanism, a device pulled from the depths of the sea, a relic 2,000 years old, and perhaps the world's first computer. In 1901, sponge divers off the coast of the Greek island Antikythera discovered the wreck of a Roman-era ship. Among the statues, pottery, and coins, they found a corroded lump of bronze and wood. At first, it seemed worthless, just debris. But when examined closely, the lump revealed gears, dozens of them, interlocked, precise, impossibly intricate for the age. Scholars were stunned. Ancient Greece was known for philosophy, mathematics, and art. But precision engineering of this scale? That belonged to the modern world. Over decades, scientists studied the fragments. X-rays revealed more than 30 bronze gears, carved with teeth finer than clockwork, mounted in a wooden frame. Inscribed on the surface were faded Greek words, instructions for use. Slowly, the purpose emerged. The Antikythera mechanism was an astronomical calculator. Turn a crank, and the gears moved to predict the position of the sun, the phases of the moon, eclipses, and even the timing of Olympic Games. It was, in essence, a computer, a mechanical model of the cosmos, and it was built in the 2nd century BCE. The implications were staggering. For centuries, the technology to cut gears with such precision did not exist. Europe would not produce clocks of comparable complexity until the 14th century, over 1,000 years later. How did Greek engineers achieve this? Who built it? And why was it lost? Some believe it was the work of Hipparchus, the great astronomer, or a disciple of Archimedes. Others think it came from a lost tradition of Hellenistic engineering, destroyed when libraries burned and empires fell. A few suggest it hints at knowledge far older, carried from civilizations we do not remember. The mechanism's accuracy was astonishing. It modeled lunar cycles with corrections for orbital irregularities. It tracked the Saros cycle of eclipses. Modern reconstructions show that with the turn of a crank, ancient sailors could foresee celestial events with precision. This was not a toy. It was a scientific instrument, built centuries before its time. And yet it vanished. Only one has ever been found, broken and scattered in a shipwreck. Was it unique, a lone invention lost with its maker? Or were there others, hidden in forgotten ruins, waiting to be discovered? The Antikythera mechanism forces us to reconsider the past. Perhaps history is not a straight line of progress, but a cycle of discovery and loss. Perhaps genius sparks earlier than we imagine, only to be extinguished and reborn. Today, the fragments rest in the National Archaeological Museum of Athens. Replicas sit in universities, reconstructed by modern engineers. And still, when we look at it, we feel the weight of mystery. Because this device tells us not only what the ancients knew, but what they may have lost. This is the Antikythera mechanism, the 2,000-year-old computer. Proof that the past may hold more of the future than we dare to believe. The Cadaver Synod, the trial of a dead pope. History is filled with trials. Some were moments of justice, others were cruel spectacles of power. But in the long catalogue of human absurdity, one stands alone. It is a trial in which the accused was already dead, his flesh decaying, his bones brittle, dragged from the grave, dressed in holy robes, and seated on a throne to face charges from the living. This was no metaphor, no legend. It happened in Rome in the year 897. The world would come to call it the Cadaver Synod, the trial of a corpse. To understand this grotesque episode, we must step into the chaos of medieval Rome. The papacy of the 9th century was not a serene throne of spiritual leadership. It was a prize, coveted, contested, seized, and fought over by noble families, rival bishops, and foreign kings. The city itself was fractured, its streets ruled as much by ambition as by faith. And into this storm walked a man named Formosus. Formosus was no ordinary cleric. He was intelligent, ambitious, and skilled in diplomacy. He became Bishop of Porto, near Rome, and was admired for his abilities. But ambition in Rome was a dangerous thing. He was drawn into the politics of the papacy, serving missions to France and Bulgaria, negotiating with kings and emperors. His rise brought enemies. Some accused him of coveting the papal throne itself. In fact, years before becoming pope, he was excommunicated for disobedience, only to be reinstated. His life was already a cycle of power, punishment and restoration. In 891, Formosus finally ascended to the throne of St. Peter, crowned as pope. For 5 years he ruled. But his reign was entangled in one of the great struggles of the age: who would control the Holy Roman Empire. Formosus supported Arnulf of Carinthia against Lambert of Spoleto. It was a gamble. When Arnulf marched into Rome and was crowned emperor, Formosus seemed secure. But fate turned. Arnulf fell ill, his power collapsed, and Lambert, the young rival Formosus had opposed, returned to power, with a family that remembered every slight. Formosus died in April 896, an old man worn down by intrigue. His enemies, however, were not content to let him rest. His successor, Stephen VI, came to power with the support of Lambert's faction. Stephen was paranoid, vengeful, and determined to erase Formosus from history. But how do you destroy a man who is already dead? You put him on trial. 9 months after Formosus was buried, Stephen ordered his body exhumed. The corpse, swollen, discolored, stinking of decay, was pulled from the tomb. Priests dressed it once more in papal robes. A crown was placed on its skull. The remains were seated upright on a throne in the Basilica of St. John Lateran. And so began the trial of a dead pope. The scene must have been surreal. Cardinals, bishops, clergy assembled as if for a legitimate synod. Before them, at the head of the hall, sat the body of Formosus, slumped silent, his dead eyes staring at nothing. Beside him stood a trembling deacon, appointed to act as his advocate, forced to defend a corpse. And on the opposite side, Pope Stephen VI, red-faced, shouting, his voice echoing off the stone walls. The charges were read aloud. Formosus was accused of perjury, of coveting the papacy, of violating canon law by being bishop of more than one see. You, Stephen bellowed, pointing at the cadaver, you usurped the throne of St. Peter. You dared to pollute the holy office. The body of Formosus did not move. The deacon stammered weakly in his defense, speaking for a man who could not answer. Witnesses were called, not to offer evidence, but to echo the fury of Stephen. The hall was filled with the stench of rot, the whispers of scandal, the spectacle of madness. Days passed, the farce dragging on, until at last a verdict was announced. Formosus was guilty. The sentence was savage. The papacy of Formosus was declared null and void. Every act, every ordination, every decree erased. His corpse was stripped of its vestments. The 3 fingers of his right hand, those with which he had blessed the faithful, were cut off. The body was dragged from the throne, hauled through the streets of Rome, and thrown to the jeers of the crowd. Finally, it was cast into the Tiber River, consigned to oblivion. But history has a way of turning. The grotesque trial shocked even the cynical Romans. Whispers spread that Stephen had gone mad, that he had insulted not just Formosus, but the dignity of the church itself. Within months, anger boiled over. Stephen was seized, imprisoned, and strangled to death. Meanwhile, the body of Formosus was recovered from the river, reburied with honor, and later restored by papal decree. The cadaver synod became infamous, a stain upon the church. Later popes would repudiate it, condemn it, erase its verdict. But it could never be forgotten. It was the moment when politics and paranoia drove men to desecrate the very dead, when justice was twisted into theater, and the grave itself offered no refuge from vengeance. For historians, it is a window into the dark age of the papacy, a time when Rome was not ruled by saints but by factions and feuds, when the throne of St. Peter was as bloody as any king's crown. For us, it is a reminder of how far hatred can go, and how fragile institutions are when consumed by fear. The cadaver synod is grotesque. It is absurd. And it is true. A dead man was tried, condemned, mutilated, and cast aside, all in the name of power. No legend, no metaphor, just the madness of history. The Nuremberg Celestial Battle of 1561. The morning of April 14th, 1561, began like any other in the German city of Nuremberg. A cool spring wind carried the scent of bread from the ovens. The cobblestone streets echoed with merchants pulling open their stalls. The bells of St. Sebaldus Church tolled across the rooftops. Yet within minutes, the calm routine of the city dissolved into chaos. For above them, in the pale light of dawn, the sky had turned into a battlefield. Men and women dropped their tools. Children pointed upward in terror. The sun rose through a haze of crimson and gray, but in that light appeared shapes, dozens at first, then hundreds. Spheres, rods, crosses, and tubes. They moved with impossible speed, darting, colliding, chasing one another like armies at war. Red and black globes swirled, some bursting into flame. Cylinders appeared to open, releasing more spheres that shot across the sky like arrows loosed from invisible bows. Trails of smoke marked their paths, streaks that glowed against the rising sun. Hans Glaser, a local printer, would later carve the scene into wood and publish it in a broadsheet. His woodcut survives to this day, a stark depiction of what so many swore they had seen. The sky filled with strange objects. Below, the citizens of Nuremberg stand clustered in the streets, their faces lifted in shock and fear. At the bottom of the image lies a great, dark, spear-shaped form, descending toward the earth. Glaser's text, printed beneath the woodcut, was explicit. He wrote of globes, red, black, orange, and blue, that engaged in a fearful spectacle before the sun, battling violently. He described how many fell to the earth, burning and smoldering, and how, after the chaos, a dark object appeared on the horizon. His conclusion was simple. This was no mere curiosity, but a sign from God, calling us to repentance. To the people of the 16th century, there was no doubt that such an event was an omen. A vision in the heavens was a warning. But what truly happened in Nuremberg that morning? Some historians point to atmospheric optics. When sunlight refracts through ice crystals, strange halos, crosses, and arcs can appear. A sundog can make multiple suns visible. Vertical light pillars can look like spears. To untrained eyes, these could seem alive, clashing across the dawn. Yet the Nuremberg account insists on movement, on chasing, colliding, falling, things that halos and sundogs do not do. Others argue that the woodcut was symbolic, not literal, a medieval allegory of religious conflict, published at a time when Europe was fractured by the Reformation. But this theory falters on one detail: the testimony was collective. Citizens swore they had seen the sky alive with objects. It was not just an artist's imagination. Then there are the parallels. In Basel, Switzerland, just 5 years later, another broadsheet recorded a similar event. Dark spheres filled the morning sky, moving as though in combat. Once again, witnesses spoke of a battle above their city. Two separate events, close in time and distance, both depicted in public records. Modern UFO researchers see these as among the earliest mass sightings. The shapes described, spheres, rods, cylinders, match reports that continue into the present. The detail of objects emerging from larger tubes echoes modern accounts of unidentified aerial phenomena. Was Nuremberg the stage for something far beyond natural optics? Skeptics warn against retrofitting. To impose the idea of UFOs on 16th century people, they argue, is to distort history. Yet the stubborn persistence of the imagery unsettles. Why would Hans Glaser risk his reputation with a hoax? Why would he publish a scene that thousands of citizens could dispute if it were false? What lingers is the weight of the unknown. Whether omen, allegory, or anomaly, the Nuremberg celestial battle captured a moment when the ordinary morning sky became unrecognizable. People who had never questioned the heavens suddenly saw war raging above them. And the memory was carved into wood, preserved for centuries, so that we too might wonder what unfolded that day. The broadsheet ends with a warning that humanity should take the event as a sign to repent. But perhaps the deeper warning is different, that the sky itself still holds mysteries, that above us, unseen, forces move beyond our understanding. April 14th, 1561. A morning in Nuremberg. A city frozen in awe and fear. A battle fought not on earth, but above it. And 5 centuries later, we still look at Glaser's woodcut and feel the same chill, that we are staring at a record of something extraordinary, something we cannot explain. And that wraps up our journey for today. We hope the stories you heard not only sparked your curiosity, but also brought you a sense of calm and relaxation, guiding you gently toward a restful night's sleep. If you enjoyed this video, please hit subscribe, tap the like button, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support truly means the world to us, and it inspires us to keep creating more wisdom-filled journeys to relax your mind and ease you into sweet dreams. Thank you so much for spending your time with Sleep Wisdom Official. Wishing you peace of mind, deep rest, and the sweetest dreams. We'll see you in the next video.